Hello, I'm Chris Gaelic. Just over 4 years ago, our government was planning to introduce teaching New Zealand history into our primary schools, and I became increasingly aware of how little I knew of our early history. So I began reading, starting with some of our modern historians, before I discovered that the early settlers, traders and missionaries had recorded eyewitness accounts of the life they experienced in this new land. Even the son of the famous warrior chief Te Rauparaha had recorded what he observed during his father's campaigns. This provided me with both a Maori and European perspective. I was gobsmacked. New Zealand has this amazing history filled with larger-than-life characters, both Maori and Pākehā. It was a cauldron of competing interests, fierce battles, astonishing friendships, and a conflict of ideologies. And it was all documented by people living at the time. It's freely available for anyone to read if you know where to look. And I might add that it is far from the anemic narrative of colonisation that is being taught in our primary schools and promoted in the media. Let me give you an example from the book Hariru Wikitoria by Brian Mackerel. On the 15th of July 1863, a small group of Maori rangatira waited with bated breath for the arrival of Queen Victoria. As she entered, accompanied by 3 of her children, the Maori party saluted their queen, with each one stepping forward to greet her. Wharepapa described how their hearts beat high within them in expectation to their great mother Victoria, she who had authority to protect them and was mighty to quell the disputes in their land. The Queen replied, "I am happy to see the New Zealand chiefs in this country. It will ever be my aim to do them good and to see that they at all times obtain justice." Now, Harriata Pomeroy was visibly pregnant, and she became embarrassed when she struggled to curtsy and kiss the Queen's hand. However, Victoria responded with pleasure at the prospect of the birth of a New Zealand child of distinction in this country. She then offered to be the child's godmother on its birth and provided for the mother to have a comfortable place to stay until the birth, after which the Queen wished to be introduced to the child. She paid all of Harriata's expenses, including a first-class passage back to New Zealand and the subsequent costs of the young boy's education as a gentleman. Now, this was the same Queen that Maori had entered the treaty with 23 years earlier. Their meeting was everything that they could have imagined and more. And yet, just 3 days earlier, General Cameron had begun the invasion of the Waikato. To understand why this happened, we need to examine the turbulent times leading up to this tragic event, which fragmented Maori, effectively destroying their economy in the Waikato and souring Maori and European relations. 43 years earlier, the missionary Thomas Kendall introduced 2 Maori rangatira to King George IV. The king was so impressed with Hongi Hika and Waikato that he took them for a personal tour through his armoury and presented Hongi with a suit of chainmail and 2 muskets. They returned via Sydney, where they stayed with the missionary Samuel Marsden, who was also hosting 4 other rangatira from the Greater Auckland region. This is what J.B. Marsden recorded in his book, The Life and Times of Samuel Marsden. Shanghi, or Hongi, paid a visit to England about the year 1820. His majestic person, graceful manners, and gentle yet manly disposition were much admired. He was one of nature's nobles. What might not be expected from such a man when he returned home again? Returning by way of Sydney, he there happened to meet with Inaki, another chief, with whom he had an ancient feud. He told him that when they got back to New Zealand, he would fight him. Inaki accepted the challenge, and Shongi accordingly assembled, on his return to New Zealand, no fewer than 2,000 men to attack Inaki. On finally shooting Inaki, the savage Shongi immediately sprang forward, scooped out the eye of the dying man with his knife and swallowed it, and then holding his hands to his throat, into which he had plunged his knife, and from which the blood flowed copiously, drank as much of the horrid beverage as the two hands could hold. With the sword which he had received as a present from King George in England, he immediately cut off the heads of 16 of his captives in cold blood. This was done to appease the spirit of his son-in-law, who had fallen in battle. Now, the missionaries estimated that there were around 4,000 Maori living in the area around present-day Mount Wellington and Panmure. Hongi attacked and destroyed their villages and their two defensive pa. More than 1,300 were killed, with many more enslaved. The rest fled south to their relatives in the Waikato for protection. The Auckland region was abandoned and remained deserted for around 15 years. Now, Samuel Marsden described Hongi as a loving family man. However, he had been raised from early childhood as his iwi's enforcer. It was his responsibility to gain utu for past offences and to avenge insults from other iwi and hapu. And he had already seen his older brother and sister killed in an earlier battle. Hongi was a brilliant war leader. He was also a product of his own culture at that time. He could be your best friend, but you dare not cross him. So the Musket Wars had begun and would rage throughout both the North and South Islands for the next 17 years. It was a savage time driven by utu, the need for revenge to balance previous wrongs, to claim land, or just to get more slaves. Paul Moon writes about this in his book, A Savage Country, and there are many other books that describe this period in our history. Intertribal fighting had been endemic for generations. Muskets made this much worse. And new foods like potatoes made it possible to sustain longer campaigns. The slaves forced to accompany these campaigns would be eaten for food, as were defeated tribes. During this time, New Zealand was known as the Cannibal Islands. Ron Crosby's book on the Musket Wars covers these campaigns in great detail and is essential reading if you want to learn about this period. It covers the years between 1806 and 1845. Likewise for the book written by Tamahana Te Rauparaha, who described what he saw during his father's campaigns down the Kapiti Coast and on into the South Island. These wars ultimately spread throughout most of New Zealand. Hongi Hika, supported by other Ngāpuhi chiefs, invaded most of the North Island in multiple waves, travelling by waka down both coasts and even across mountain ranges to attack Rotorua on Makoia Island. The Waikato tribes counterattacked as they gained access to muskets. They then drove Te Rauparaha out of Kawhia before invading Taranaki, leaving the land desolate until it was sold to the New Zealand Company for European and Maori settlement. Te Rauparaha's Ngāti Toa travelled down through Taranaki, along the west coast, decimating the tribes in his path. After establishing his base on Kapiti Island, he then set his sights on Te Waiponamu, the South Island. He succeeded in conquering the top half of the South Island before his alliance with his supporting tribes fractured and he was forced to stop. And these are just some of the campaigns. There were many others. Trading for muskets drove the economy at that time, as every tribe struggled to buy muskets to defend themselves and then to counterattack. The resulting fighting, combined with imported infectious diseases, reduced the total Maori population to around half of what it had been. The missionaries estimated that between 20,000 and 40,000 lives were lost. Maori were astute, battle-hardened warriors, and they demanded respect from the Europeans living among them. Counterbalancing this was the work of the missionaries, which began at the end of 1814 when Samuel Marsden established a mission in the Bay of Islands. After 10 years, their message of peace and forgiveness had begun to take hold, and some tribes converted to Christianity, committing to living in peace and even freeing slaves that were taken in earlier battles. But this created a new problem, as the newly converted Christian Maori had no defence against the majority who would still wage war to avenge earlier offences or insults to their mana. There was now a power imbalance with no clear solution. Adding to this, in the mid-1830s, the French and the English were competing with each other for trade and colonial possessions. So, when the French ship, La Favourite, arrived in the Bay of Islands in 1831, one of the missionaries, William Yate, wrote an urgent letter to the Governor of New South Wales, requesting protection from King William IV. It was signed by 13 northern chiefs, and the Governor then sent a ship to the Bay of Islands to warn the French that New Zealand was under British protection. 4 years later, in 1835, the French Baron de Thierry arrived in the Bay of Islands, claiming the land in the Hokianga that Hongi Hika had sold to him for muskets during Hongi's trip to England. De Thierry had come to set up a sovereign government in New Zealand. Hongi was now dead, and Northern Maori totally rejected his claim. A declaration of independence was prepared by the northern tribes and was accepted by the British Crown. Finally, in 1838, the French government sent a ship filled with new immigrants to settle in the South Island harbour of Akaroa, forcing the British government to consider formally colonising New Zealand. This all came to a head the following year when the New Zealand Company was set up by Edward Gibbon Wakefield to buy land and establish a colony. Their ship, the Tory, arrived in Wellington and was initially welcomed by Maori, who were looking for an end to the intertribal fighting and were hoping for a better life that working together with the new settlers might bring. Maori sold large areas of land around Marlborough and Wellington, as well as up the Kapiti coast to Whanganui and including Taranaki. However, the Anglican missionaries were strongly opposed to the New Zealand Company's plans, and they set about advising Maori that they had been cheated and that these new settlers were devils who would drive them from their remaining land as soon as they were strong enough. Maori began to lose their trust in the new settlers, and this laid the foundation for future troubles in the Taranaki and elsewhere. When the Tories set sail from England, Britain was finally forced to take action and commissioned William Hobson to offer Maori protection through ceding sovereignty to the British Crown. The treaty presented at Waitangi offered Maori a way out. The lands they had already sold in dubious land deals would be restored, and future sales would be regulated by the governor. Plus they would have protection from foreign invasion, and the intertribal fighting would be brought to an end. Northern Maori agreed, including most of the rangatira throughout the rest of New Zealand, but not all. So this is a brief outline of the background leading up to signing the Treaty at Waitangi. The Maori rangatira had real mana, and this was recognised in the treaty that was being offered to them. But there is an important question that needs to be answered: whether or not Maori, as a proud warrior people, really ceded sovereignty to the British Crown. This is still reverberating through the news today, and I will cover this in my next podcast. So how should we move forward to create a better future? You'll see from what I've just covered that New Zealand had a violent history prior to signing the treaty. And yet knowing about this history is vital for understanding everything that follows. My book, Moving Forward from Our Past, discovers the key events in our past from just before Europeans arrived, continuing through to the impact of the early whalers, traders and missionaries, and leading up to the treaty. It discusses the treaty in detail, and then outlines the progress of Maori following the treaty, including how the early positive progress that was made disintegrated in the years that followed. My book takes you on a journey back in time to when life was very different to what we know today. It goes into far more detail than I can provide in this podcast, and it includes all the references that you can check for yourself. It provides a foundation for deciding how we should address the outstanding issues from our past so that we can work positively together to move forward and build a better future. Click on the link below if you'd like to purchase my book. On the website, you can also download for free many of the earlier books that I've used as references. My next podcast will cover whether or not Maori ceded sovereignty. Be sure to check it out. Click on the subscribe button below to be notified when it is ready.